You are nothing but a mistake that should have been drowned at birth." The words hit like shards of ice against her spine, each syllable designed to cut deeper than the last. Lyra felt them settle into the familiar hollow space in her chest where all the cruelties lived, a collection 20 years in the making. She kept her eyes fixed on the stone floor of the arena, watching dirty water swirl around the bristles of her scrub brush as she worked to remove yesterday's bloodstains from the sacred fighting grounds. Beta Marcus stood over her, his shadow blocking what little morning light filtered through the arena's entrance. She could smell the satisfaction rolling off him in waves, the particular pleasure he took in reminding her of her place. It had always been enough for him, this power over the one person in the Crimson Moon Pack who could not fight back. The other servants scattered when Marcus approached, but Lyra had learned long ago that running only made it worse. Better to endure, to become invisible, to let the words wash over her like rain until they were done. She had spent her whole life being told she was nothing, being treated as less than, and she had survived by making peace with that truth. But today was different. Today the air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation, charged with an energy that made her wolf pace restlessly just beneath her skin. The war games were only 3 days away, and the entire pack compound buzzed with preparation for the most sacred ceremony in their world. Ancient war beasts would be brought from the deep forests, creatures of myth and legend that hadn't chosen warriors in living memory. The arena where Lyra knelt scrubbing stones would soon host a ritual older than the pack itself. Everything changed when you are chosen by a beast, they said. Everything changed when you proved your worth to the ancestors themselves. Lyra had never entertained such fantasies. She was the pack's invisible girl, the one they used to clean and serve and disappear on command. She had no wolf strong enough to shift, no bloodline worth claiming, no beauty to compensate for her failures. The mate bond had never called to her, and she had long since stopped expecting it would. Marcus moved closer, his boot inches from her scrubbing hand. "She knows her place," he said to someone behind him, probably one of the younger betas who followed him around like devoted hounds. "Look how well trained she is. 20 years of breaking will do that to the worthless ones." The laughter that followed was sharp and knowing, the sound of predators amusing themselves with prey that had long since stopped struggling. Lyra continued scrubbing, her movements mechanical and practiced. The stone beneath her brush was already clean, had been clean for the past 10 minutes, but stopping would mean acknowledging them, and acknowledgement always made things worse. Then she heard the whisper that made her blood freeze. "They say the shadow beast is coming." The words were barely breathed, spoken with the kind of reverence reserved for the most ancient powers. Lyra's brush stilled against the stone, though she kept her head down, her posture submissive. The shadow beast was legend, a creature so old and powerful that most believed it to be myth. The last warrior it had chosen lived 3 centuries ago, and that bonding had shaped the destiny of the entire continent. Marcus's voice dropped to match the hushed tone of the others gathering around them. "My cousin in the King's Guard sent word yesterday. They are bringing it from the sacred grove, along with 7 other war beasts. The ceremony will be unlike anything our pack has witnessed." Lyra felt something shift in her chest, a flutter of awareness that had no place in her carefully constructed world of invisibility. Her wolf, usually silent and weak, lifted its head as if scenting something on the wind. She pressed the feeling down, forced herself to focus on the repetitive motion of the brush against stone. Hope was a luxury she could not afford. The conversation above her head continued, voices growing more animated as they discussed the implications of the war games. Which warriors would be chosen? Which beasts might finally break their centuries of solitude? Which bloodlines would be elevated by the ancient magic of the bonding? And then Marcus said something that made her heart stop entirely. "Selene will bond with the shadow beast, if the creature chooses anyone at all. She is the strongest female warrior we have ever produced, with a bloodline that traces back to the first Alpha Kings. If any of us are worthy of such an honour, it would be her. The agreement was immediate and fervent. Selene Nightshade was everything Lyra was not: beautiful, powerful, connected to the pack's most prestigious family. She moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never been told she was worthless, never been forced to scrub floors or empty chamber pots or disappear when her betters required space. When Selene walked into a room, every eye followed her with admiration or desire. When Lyra entered the same space, people looked through her as if she were made of air. But before she could stop herself, before she could catch the thought and bury it with all the other dangerous hopes she had learned to kill, Lyra found herself wondering what it would feel like to be chosen, what it would mean to have an ancient creature of legend look at her and see something worth claiming. The fantasy lasted exactly 3 seconds before Marcus's boot connected with her shoulder, sending her sprawling across the wet stones. The scrub brush flew from her hand, clattering against the arena wall with a sound that echoed in the sudden silence. "Know your place," he snarled, though she had done nothing but kneel quietly and work. "The war games are not for creatures like you. They are for warriors, for those with honour and strength and bloodlines worth preserving. You will watch from the servants' section if you are lucky, and you will remember that some things in this world are sacred." Lyra pushed herself back to her knees, tasting blood where her teeth had cut her lip in the fall. She reached for the brush with steady hands, giving no sign that his words had found their mark. This too was practised, this recovery from casual cruelty. She had learned to absorb the impact without breaking, to bend without snapping, to endure without giving them the satisfaction of seeing her pain. As she resumed scrubbing, the group above her dispersed to their own preparations, their laughter fading into the morning air. Marcus lingered for a moment longer, ensuring she understood the lesson, then followed the others toward the pack house, where more important matters awaited his attention. Alone in the arena, Lyra finally allowed herself to breathe. Her shoulder throbbed where his boot had struck, and she could feel the beginning of what would surely become an impressive bruise. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in her chest, the hollow space where dreams went to die. 3 days. In 3 days, the most powerful creatures in their world would walk these stones she was cleaning, and the destiny of the pack would be decided by bonds forged in ancient magic. Warriors would be chosen, bloodlines elevated, legends born, and she would watch from the shadows, invisible as always, forgotten as always, worth nothing as always. The arena stretched before her, vast and empty and stained with the promise of greatness that would never touch her life. Lyra dipped her brush in the bucket and continued scrubbing, preparing a sacred space for miracles that were not meant for girls like her. But deep in her chest, buried beneath 20 years of carefully constructed acceptance, something stirred. Her wolf lifted its head again, scenting the wind with an attention she had never felt before. And for just a moment, impossible and dangerous and utterly foolish, Lyra allowed herself to wonder if the war games might hold surprises that no one, not even Marcus, not even Selene, not even she herself, could possibly expect. The power that had been locked away for 20 years refused to be contained any longer. As Lyra stood in the centre of the arena, golden light blazing from her transformed form, she felt the suppression barriers that had defined her entire existence continuing to crumble. Each breath brought new awareness, new strength, new understanding of abilities that had been deliberately hidden since birth. Her wolf, no longer the weak, whimpering creature she had always known, rose within her consciousness like a force of nature finally given freedom. The shadow beast pressed closer to her side, and through their completed mate bond she felt his ancient consciousness reaching out to guide her through the overwhelming flood of awakened power. Centuries of accumulated knowledge flowed between them, teaching her things that could not be learned through training or study. How to channel the golden fire that wanted to pour from her fingertips, how to speak with the voice of command that made stones tremble and hearts submit, how to see the threads of fate and magic that connected all living things in patterns too complex for mortal minds to fully grasp. But it was when the other war beasts began approaching that she truly understood the magnitude of what was happening. The silver-furred creature with winter storm eyes padded forward first, its massive head lowering in the same gesture of submission the shadow beast had offered. But this wasn't just acknowledgement of her bond with their leader. This was recognition of something deeper, more fundamental. Through her awakened senses, she could feel the ancient consciousness residing within the creature, and with dawning wonder she realized what she was perceiving. These weren't just war beasts that had chosen to attend the ceremony. They were the other lost kings, the legendary rulers who had been transformed by the same forces that had created the shadow beast centuries ago. One by one, they approached and offered their submission. The golden-maned beast whose steps left scorched prints, a fire king from the southern territories who had chosen transformation over death when his kingdom fell to invaders. The creature of living shadow whose form shifted like smoke, a master of stealth and assassination who had ruled from the darkness between kingdoms. Each one carried the consciousness of someone who had once commanded armies, who had shaped the course of history, who had chosen to become legend rather than accept defeat. And they recognized her not just as their leader's mate, but as their queen. The implications crashed over her in waves that made her knees threaten to buckle. She wasn't just bonded to Darius, she was connected to all of them, the lost rulers who had been waiting centuries for someone worthy of their allegiance. The suppressed power in her bloodline wasn't just royal heritage. It was the key that could unite forces that had been scattered across lifetimes. As each war beast offered its submission, she felt new abilities awakening within her consciousness. From the winter storm, king came mastery over ice and snow, the ability to freeze enemies in their tracks or call blizzards from clear skies. From the fire, king came control over flame and heat, power to forge weapons from molten steel or burn through any barrier. From the shadow king came the art of moving unseen, of striking from darkness, of reading the secrets that people tried to hide. But it was from her own mate, the shadow beast who was also Darius, that she received the greatest gift of all. Through their bond came knowledge of rulership itself, how to command not through fear but through respect, how to make decisions that would echo across generations, how to balance mercy with justice in ways that preserved both strength and compassion. The transformation was no longer just physical. She was becoming something new, something that had never existed before. A queen who could command not just human armies, but the legendary forces that most people believed were myths. The crowd that remained in the arena watched in hushed awe as power continued to pour through her in visible waves. The golden light emanating from her skin grew brighter, and symbols began appearing on her arms and throat, marks that glowed silver white and pulsed with the rhythm of her heartbeat. Ancient runes that identified her bloodline, her abilities, her right to command forces that could reshape continents. But with power came responsibility that threatened to crush her beneath its weight. Through her enhanced senses, she could perceive things that remained hidden from others. The network of alliances and enemies that connected every pack, every kingdom, every ruler across the known world. The delicate balance that kept ancient hatreds from exploding into wars that would devastate millions. The prophecies and predictions that had shaped political decisions for generations. Her emergence as the lost Silver Moon heir would trigger every one of those carefully maintained tensions. Already she could see the implications playing out like threads of possibility spreading into the future. Kingdoms that had fought wars over her bloodline's territory would demand recognition of old claims. Rulers who had married into alliances specifically designed to prevent her family's return would find their treaties suddenly worthless. Ancient enemies who had thought the Silver Moon line extinct would mobilize armies to ensure it remained that way. And at the center of it all would be her relationship with Darius, the mate bond that connected her not just to a king, but to the legendary creature whose power had shaped the political landscape for centuries. Through the golden thread that connected them, she felt his human consciousness blazing with the same overwhelming awareness. He understood as clearly as she did what her transformation meant for his 7 kingdoms, for the alliances that kept them strong, for the enemies that would see her existence as an unacceptable threat to their own power. But there was something else flowing through their bond, something that made her heart soar despite the crushing weight of responsibility. Love, recognition, the profound rightness of 2 souls that had found each other across impossible odds and would not be separated by politics or prophecy or the fears of those who profited from division. As the golden light around her began to stabilize, as the runes on her skin settled into permanent patterns that marked her as queen to both mortal and mythic forces, Lyra felt the last of her old life falling away like a discarded skin. She would never again scrub floors or empty chamber pots or make herself invisible to avoid the notice of her betters. She would never again accept cruelty as the natural order or believe herself worthless because others told her she was nothing. But she would also never again know the safety of powerlessness, the protection that came from being overlooked and forgotten. Every choice she made from this moment forward would echo across kingdoms. Every word she spoke would be analysed for political implications. Every breath she took would be monitored by those who saw her existence as either salvation or damnation for their carefully ordered world. The war beasts formed a protective circle around her as power continued to settle into new patterns, their ancient consciousnesses radiating contentment at finally finding someone worthy of their millennia-long wait. Through them, she could feel the pulse of magic that connected all living things, the network of forces that most people never suspected existed. She was no longer just Lyra Silvermoon, lost princess finally claiming her birthright. She was something new, something unprecedented, a queen who could command both the political forces that shaped kingdoms and the legendary powers that existed beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding. The transformation was complete, but as she stood in the centre of an arena that had become the focal point for forces that would reshape the known world, Lyra understood with crystal clarity that her real journey was only beginning. Now she had to learn how to be everything she had never dreamed she could become, while surviving in a world where her very existence would trigger conflicts that could destroy everything she had come to love. The moment of choice arrived like thunder splitting the sky, and Darius chose love over kingdoms. The royal platform, carved from obsidian and inlaid with gems that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, trembled beneath his feet as he rose from the throne that had defined his identity for decades. Around the arena, the remaining crowd held its collective breath, understanding that they were about to witness a decision that would reshape the political landscape of 7 kingdoms. Through the mate bond, Lyra felt every nuance of his internal struggle, the weight of treaties signed in blood, of alliances that kept millions safe, of responsibilities that had been drilled into him since childhood. Against all of that stood the golden thread that connected their souls, the recognition that had blazed between them from the first moment their eyes met, the certainty that some truths transcended every political consideration. He began to descend the steps, each footfall echoing through the arena like the tolling of funeral bells for the old order. The transformation was visible in every line of his body, no longer the controlled perfection of a king performing his duties, but something raw and powerful and utterly uncompromising. This was Darius stripped of pretense, allowing the world to see what lay beneath the crown. But before he could reach her, before he could make the declaration that would shatter centuries of careful diplomacy, Celine's faction moved. They emerged from the shadows at the arena's edge like a plague of locusts, desperate people who had invested everything in her expected elevation to legendary status. Their faces carried the particular madness of those watching their world collapse, and the weapons in their hands gleamed with the kind of desperation that made negotiation impossible. "If we cannot have the Shadow Beast's bond," the leader snarled, his voice carrying across the arena with venom that could poison rivers, "then no one will. Kill the pretender. Kill the king who would betray every alliance for the sake of an impossible obsession." They attacked from all sides, a coordinated assault designed to eliminate both Lyra and Darius before the mate bond could be publicly claimed. Blades flashed in the afternoon sun, and arrows whistled through the air with accuracy born of years of training and the particular focus that came from having nothing left to lose. The war beasts exploded into motion, 7 legendary creatures, each one carrying the consciousness of rulers who had once commanded armies, moved with speed and precision that defied physics. The silver-furred Winter King became a blur of ice and fury, freezing attackers in mid-stride before shattering them like glass sculptures. The golden-maned Fire King breathed flames that turned steel to slag and reduced enemies to ash before their weapons could find targets. But it was the Shadow Beast that inspired true terror. 8 feet of primordial power moved through the attacking force like death given form and purpose, massive jaws clamping down on enemies with force that could crush stone. When he roared, the sound shattered windows throughout the compound and sent those attackers still capable of movement fleeing in mindless panic. This was why the Shadow Beast was legend, not just for his size or strength, but for the terrible efficiency with which he protected what belonged to him. And Lyra belonged to him as surely as he belonged to her, a bond that made threatening her the equivalent of declaring war on forces that had shaped the destiny of continents. Through their connection, she felt his ancient consciousness blazing with protective fury that bordered on divine wrath. But she also felt something else, something that made her heart soar despite the violence exploding around them. Joy, pure, overwhelming joy that he no longer had to hide what she meant to him, that he could finally unleash the full extent of his devotion without concern for political consequences or diplomatic niceties. The battle was over before it truly began. Selene's faction, for all their desperation and training, were mortal warriors attempting to challenge creatures that existed at the intersection of flesh and myth. Within minutes, the arena floor was painted with evidence of their failure, and the few survivors had fled into the compound's maze of buildings like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Silence fell over the arena, broken only by the soft sounds of settling dust and the distant cries of those pack members who had witnessed powers beyond their comprehension unleashed in defence of their newly revealed queen. Darius continued his descent from the royal platform, his golden eyes blazing with emotions too complex to name. When he reached the arena floor, when he stood before her in his human form while his beast consciousness radiated contentment from their bond, the weight of kingdoms seemed to fall away entirely. "Your Majesty," Alpha Morrison began, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to process what had just occurred. "The political implications, the treaties, the alliances that depend on—" "Enough," Darius said quietly, and the single word carried authority that made stones tremble. "The political implications are simple. I claim Lyra Silvermoon as my mate, my queen, my equal in all things. Any kingdom that objects to this choice is free to test their strength against mine." The declaration hit the charged air like lightning, illuminating truths that had been hidden beneath centuries of careful diplomacy. This wasn't just a mating announcement. It was a challenge to every power structure that had profited from keeping the Silvermoon bloodline extinct. But there were also those in the crowd whose faces blazed with hope and recognition, and the kind of joy that came from witnessing the fulfillment of prophecies they had carried in their hearts for decades. Pack members who remembered the old stories, who understood that the return of the lost bloodline meant more than political upheaval. It meant the possibility of healing wounds that had festered since the Great War. Through the mate bond, Lyra felt Darius's consciousness expanding to encompass not just his own kingdoms, but the broader implications of their union. With her bloodline came claims to territories that had been in dispute for generations, alliances with powers that had remained neutral for centuries, the possibility of uniting forces that had never been brought together under a single banner. The prophecy Elder Moira had revealed blazed through her awareness with new clarity. The last silver moon heir will either unite the kingdoms in an age of unprecedented peace or destroy them all in fire and blood. Standing in an arena painted with the blood of those who had tried to prevent their bonding, surrounded by legendary creatures who had pledged their allegiance, feeling the mate bond singing between them like the universe celebrating, Lyra finally understood what choice the prophecy was offering. They could use their combined power to forge a new order, to heal the divisions that had kept their people weak and scattered, or the very attempt to do so could trigger conflicts that would devastate everything they sought to protect. But as Darius reached out to take her hands, as the shadow beast pressed against her side in fierce possessive devotion, as the other war beasts maintained their protective circle around the mated pair, she realized the choice had already been made. Some risks were worth taking. Some bonds were worth fighting for. Some truths were too powerful to remain hidden, regardless of the consequences. The lost princess had found her king. The legendary creature had chosen his queen, and together they would reshape the world or die in the attempt. The mate bond blazed between them with intensity that made the arena stones sing in harmonic resonance, and Lyra knew with absolute certainty that everything was about to change. The war for their future was about to begin. 3 months after the mate bond completed, Lyra stood on the balcony of the Obsidian Palace, overlooking 7 kingdoms that now called her queen. The transformation of the political landscape had been swift and brutal, kingdoms choosing sides with the efficiency of armies preparing for war. Some had welcomed the return of the Silver Moon bloodline, seeing in her emergence the possibility of healing divisions that had festered for generations. Others had declared her existence an unacceptable threat to carefully maintained power structures, mobilizing forces that had remained dormant since the last Great War. But they had survived the initial chaos through a combination of legendary power and strategic brilliance that surprised even their enemies. The war beasts proved to be more than mythical creatures. They were living repositories of military knowledge accumulated across centuries, their ancient consciousnesses offering tactical advice that had never been recorded in any manual of warfare. The Shadow Beast, when he chose to appear in human form, revealed himself to be not just Darius, but a fusion of king and legend that commanded respect from forces that had never bent the knee to mortal authority. Through their mate bond, Lyra had learned to channel abilities that made her something unprecedented. A queen who could negotiate treaties in the morning and command blizzards in the afternoon, who could speak with the voice of diplomatic reason or unleash powers that could level mountains. The compound where she had once scrubbed floors as an invisible servant now served as the seat of an empire that spanned continents. The great hall, where she had first locked eyes with her mate across an impossible distance, had been transformed into a throne room where representatives of 12 kingdoms came to pledge allegiance or negotiate terms of surrender. But it was the people who had changed most of all. Pack members who had once treated her with casual cruelty now served with the devotion of those who had witnessed miracles firsthand. Beta Marcus, whose boot had once sent her sprawling across wet stones, now bore scars from defending her castle when 3 armies had attempted simultaneous assault. Even Selene, broken and humbled by her failed rebellion, had eventually requested audience to offer formal submission to the Queen, whose worthiness she had been too blind to see. The prophecy Elder Moira had revealed was proving itself with each passing day, though the path toward fulfillment remained fraught with challenges that tested every aspect of their combined strength. The last Silver Moon heir would either unite the kingdoms or destroy them all. And with each treaty signed, each enemy defeated, each alliance forged, it became clearer which direction history was choosing. The sound of familiar footsteps made her turn from the view of kingdoms spread below like a tapestry woven from gold and shadow. Darius approached across the marble floor, his presence still capable of stealing her breath even after months of shared sovereignty. In human form, he carried himself with the controlled grace of a king who had never known defeat. But she could feel the shadow beast's consciousness purring contentment through their bond, ancient power satisfied by the mate who had proven worthy of legends. "Your Majesty," he said with the formal courtesy they maintained in public, though his golden eyes blazed with emotions that had nothing to do with politics or protocol. "Your Majesty," she replied, matching his tone while the mate bond sang between them with harmonics that made the palace stones resonate in sympathetic vibration. "The reports from the Eastern Territories," he continued, settling beside her against the balcony rail with the easy familiarity of a partner who had stood by her side through battles that would be remembered for centuries. "3 more kingdoms have requested formal audience to discuss terms of alliance. The northern provinces are prepared to cede disputed territories in exchange for protection guarantees, and the Southern Confederacy has withdrawn their forces from our borders entirely." She nodded, processing the implications with the strategic mind that had awakened alongside her suppressed power. Each victory brought them closer to the unified continent the prophecy promised, but also closer to the final confrontation with forces that would never accept her rule. "And our enemies?" His expression grew more serious, though she felt no fear through their connection. The shadow beast had faced threats that could destroy kingdoms and emerged victorious every time. Whatever challenges remained, they would face them together. "The Western Alliance continues to mass forces along the mountain passes," he said quietly. "They have recruited mercenaries from across the known world, including some who claim knowledge of weapons designed specifically to harm legendary creatures, but their spies also report growing dissent in their own ranks. Many of their warriors remember the old stories, the prophecies that speak of the silver moon return, bringing an age of peace. Peace. The word carried weight that had nothing to do with mere absence of conflict. Through her enhanced senses, she could perceive the threads of possibility that stretched into the future, the pathways that led toward true unity among peoples who had spent centuries believing they were natural enemies. But there was something else she could sense, something that made her hand drift unconsciously to the barely perceptible changes in her body that even Darius hadn't noticed yet. The mate bond had been growing stronger with each passing day, their connection deepening beyond the physical into something that touched the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. And now it was creating something new, something that would ensure their legacy extended far beyond their own lifespans. The air was already growing within her, a spark of consciousness that carried both royal bloodline and legendary power in combinations that had never existed before. When the time came to reveal this development, it would reshape the political landscape yet again, offering hope to their allies and terror to their enemies. But tonight was not for politics or strategy or the weight of prophecies that hung over their heads like storm clouds. Tonight was for the simple miracle of 2 souls who had found each other across impossible odds and chosen love over every rational consideration. Darius must have sensed her shift in mood through their bond, because his formal expression softened into something that belonged entirely to the man rather than the king. When he reached for her hand, when his fingers intertwined with hers against the marble rail, the gesture was as natural as breathing. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying just a hint of the vulnerability that he showed only to her. "The choice to claim your birthright? The decision to stand beside me despite everything it cost?" She turned to face him fully, letting him see the truth blazing in her eyes that had transformed from muddy brown to silver starlight. The girl who had scrubbed floors and believed herself worthless was gone forever, replaced by someone who commanded forces that could reshape continents. But the love that had awakened when a king looked at a servant across a crowded hall remained exactly the same. "I regret nothing," she said simply. "Not the pain of transformation, not the weight of responsibility, not the enemies who would see us destroyed, not the battles we have yet to fight. When I stopped believing I was worthless, when I started understanding that some bonds transcend every logical objection, everything became possible." He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth through the mate bond like golden wine. Around them, the palace that had become the heart of their expanding empire settled into evening quiet, and through the windows they could see lights beginning to appear in the kingdoms spread below. Each light represented lives that had been touched by their union, people who had found hope in the prophecy made manifest, subjects who looked toward their palace, knowing that the lost bloodline had returned to heal wounds that had festered for generations. But they also represented the responsibility that would define every choice they made for the rest of their lives. Every decision would echo across those lights. Every word would be analysed for implications that could affect millions. Every breath would be monitored by those who saw their love as either salvation or damnation. The future stretched before them, vast and uncertain, and filled with challenges that would test every aspect of their combined strength. There would be more battles, more enemies, more moments when they would have to choose between mercy and justice, between personal happiness and the needs of the kingdoms they served. But they would face it all together, bound by more than politics or prophecy, or the ancient magic that had recognized their souls across lifetimes. They would face it as partners, as equals, as two halves of something larger that had finally found completion in a world that had tried its best to keep them apart. The mate bond pulsed between them with each heartbeat, and in that rhythm Lyra heard the promise that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Some truths were too powerful to be suppressed. Some loves were too strong to be denied. Some destinies were too important to be surrendered, no matter the cost. The lost princess had found her crown, the legend had chosen his queen, and together they would write the next chapter of history in light and shadow, love and power, hope, and the absolute certainty that some bonds could reshape the world. When she looked out over the kingdoms that called her queen, Lyra saw not just the culmination of everything she had never dared to dream, but the beginning of everything they would build together. The future was theirs to claim, and it would be magnificent. The days that followed were a blur of preparation that seemed to consume the very air around them. Lyra found herself assigned to the most dangerous task imaginable, preparing the beast enclosures deep beneath the arena where ancient creatures would soon be housed. The underground chambers had been sealed for decades, their stone walls carved with symbols that predated written language, their iron bars forged with metal that sang with old magic. As she descended the narrow steps with her cleaning supplies, the weight of centuries pressed against her shoulders like a living thing. The first enclosure she entered made her breath catch in her throat. Massive didn't begin to describe the space carved from living rock, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above her head. Iron bars as thick as her arms stretched from floor to ceiling, their surface etched with runes that seemed to shimmer in the torchlight. The stones beneath her feet were worn smooth by time, and something else, something that had paced these confines with restless energy for longer than she could imagine. This cage had been built for titans. She began scrubbing the ancient stones, her movements careful and reverent in the sacred space. The other servants had refused this assignment, claiming the underground chambers gave them nightmares, but Lyra had volunteered without hesitation. Down here she was truly invisible, forgotten by the pack members who were too afraid to venture into the depths where war beasts would soon prowl. The second enclosure was smaller, but somehow more terrifying, its walls bearing claw marks that gouged inches deep into solid granite. The third smelled of ozone and something metallic that made her wolf whimper and retreat to the furthest corners of her mind. Each chamber told a story of power beyond her comprehension, of creatures that existed at the intersection of flesh and legend. But it was the seventh enclosure that stopped her completely. The moment she stepped through its entrance, something shifted in the air around her. The temperature dropped by degrees, and shadows seemed to gather in corners where no shadows should exist. The bars here were different, forged from metal so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Ancient symbols covered every surface, carved deep and filled with what looked like silver that had been poured molten into the grooves. This was where the shadow beast would be held. Lyra set down her bucket with trembling hands, suddenly aware that she was standing in a space designed to contain a creature of myth. The last warrior the shadow beast had chosen had united 7 kingdoms under a single crown, had commanded armies that spanned continents, had become the stuff of legends that parents whispered to their children on dark nights, and tomorrow that same ancient power would be brought here, to these chambers she was preparing with her own hands. She began cleaning the massive space, her movements slow and careful, as if she were performing a ritual rather than completing a chore. The stones here were different too, carved from some kind of black granite that seemed to drink in the torchlight. Every surface was covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, runes that seemed to shift and writhe when she wasn't focusing on them completely. As she worked, something began building in her chest. A pressure, a pull, an awareness that had no name. Her wolf lifted its head again, that same strange attention she had felt in the arena above. But down here, surrounded by ancient magic and the promise of legendary creatures, the feeling was stronger, more insistent, more dangerous. She tried to push it down, to focus on the repetitive motions of scrubbing and cleaning, but the sensation only grew stronger. It was as if the chamber itself was watching her, evaluating her, finding her somehow familiar. Hours passed before she heard voices echoing down the stone corridors above. Pack members, probably checking on the preparations, making sure everything was ready for tomorrow's arrival. Lyra froze, her brush stilled against the black stone, listening to the footsteps grow closer. The first voice she recognized was Beta Thomas, his tone respectful and hushed in the sacred space. "The enclosures are ready, Alpha. The girl has been working since dawn. Everything is prepared according to the ancient protocols." Alpha Morrison's response was grave, weighted with the magnitude of what was coming, and the beasts arrive at sunset tomorrow. 7 creatures that haven't walked among our kind for generations, led by the shadow beast itself. The risk we take by hosting this ceremony cannot be overstated. A third voice joined them, younger and more excited. But imagine the honour if one of our warriors is chosen. The prestige alone would elevate our pack above all others. Celine has been training for this her entire life. Lyra pressed herself against the far wall of the chamber, hoping to remain unnoticed as their voices grew closer. She had learned to make herself small, to blend into shadows and corners until she became part of the architecture itself. But something was different now, something about this place that made hiding feel almost wrong. The footsteps reached the entrance to the 7th chamber, and she heard Alpha Morrison's sharp intake of breath as he saw the space for the first time. "By the ancestors," he whispered, "I had forgotten how massive these chambers are, how ancient." "The shadow beast hasn't been contained for 300 years, Beta Thomas replied, his voice dropping to match the Alpha's reverent tone. "The last time was when Warrior Queen Astrid was chosen. The bonding ceremony lasted 3 days, they say, and when it was complete, she could speak to every creature in the forest, command storms with her voice, heal mortal wounds with a touch. And now it comes here, to our pack, seeking someone worthy of such power." Alpha Morrison's words carried weight, expectation, and something that might have been fear. If it chooses no one, if we have brought it here for nothing, the dishonour could destroy us. But if it chooses Celine, the third voice finished eagerly, Our pack will be legendary for 1,000 years. The agreement was immediate and certain. Selene was the obvious choice, the only choice. She possessed everything a war beast could want in a bonded partner: strength, beauty, bloodline, training, confidence. She moved through the world with the assurance of someone destined for greatness, someone the universe itself had marked for extraordinary things. Lyra remained frozen against the wall, forgotten in the shadows of the ancient chamber, listening to them plan for a future that would reshape their world. And deep in her chest, that strange pressure continued to build, that pull that made no sense, that awareness that seemed to whisper impossible things. Tomorrow the beasts would arrive. Tomorrow the ceremony would begin. Tomorrow warriors would be tested and found worthy or wanting, and the course of history would be decided by bonds forged in magic older than memory. She should have felt nothing but resignation, the familiar acceptance of watching greatness from the servants' corner. But instead, as she knelt in the chamber built for legends, surrounded by symbols that hurt to perceive and shadows that moved with their own purpose, Lyra found herself touched by something she had never experienced before: anticipation. The word whispered through her mind like a secret, like a promise, like a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. She pressed it down, buried it beneath 20 years of learned helplessness, told herself it was merely curiosity about witnessing something historic. But her wolf knew better. Her wolf raised its head and scented the air of the ancient chamber, and for the first time in her life it did not retreat. For the first time in her life, something deep inside her responded to power instead of cowering from it. Tomorrow the shadow beast would arrive. Tomorrow legends would walk the earth once more. And Lyra, invisible servant girl who had spent her life cleaning up after her betters, would be there to witness it all. Hidden in the shadows where she belonged, watching as destiny chose champions who were worthy of miracles. She returned to scrubbing the black stones, her movements steady and practiced, preparing a sacred space for creatures that existed at the boundary between dream and reality. But now the work felt different, charged with meaning she couldn't name. Each stone she cleaned, each symbol she revealed, each rune she carefully preserved, brought them one step closer to tomorrow. One step closer to everything changing. The chamber seemed to hum around her, ancient magic stirring in response to her presence, and for just a moment, impossible and terrifying and utterly forbidden, Lyra allowed herself to wonder what would happen when legend finally returned to the world. The world shifted the moment Alpha King Darius Blackthorn crossed the threshold into their territory. Lyra felt it first as a pressure in the air, a weight that made breathing difficult and set every nerve in her body on high alert. She was scrubbing the great hall's marble floors when the sensation hit her like a physical blow, forcing her to pause mid-stroke as something deep in her chest clenched with recognition she didn't understand. Her wolf, usually silent as the grave, suddenly lifted its head with an attention so sharp it made her gasp. Then she heard the thunder. Not actual thunder, though it sounded like the sky splitting open above them. The sound was hoofbeats, dozens of them, accompanied by the jangle of armour and weapons that spoke of a royal guard trained for war. Through the great hall's massive windows she could see pack members streaming from buildings, their faces a mixture of excitement and terror, as they prepared to witness the arrival of the most powerful Alpha on the continent. Alpha King Darius had come for the war games. Lyra scrambled to her feet, her cleaning supplies forgotten, as every instinct screamed at her to hide. She had heard stories of the Blackthorn King since childhood, whispered tales of his strength, his ruthlessness, his ability to command not just wolves, but the very elements themselves. He ruled 7 kingdoms from his mountain fortress, commanded armies that had never known defeat, and bore the bloodline of the first Alpha Kings who had united their kind under a single crown. He was everything powerful and dangerous and utterly beyond her reach. But even as her rational mind told her to flee to the servants' quarters, something else held her frozen in place. That pressure in her chest was building, becoming almost unbearable, as if her very bones were trying to pull her in a direction she couldn't identify. Her wolf was going insane inside her, pacing and whimpering and pushing against barriers that had contained it for 20 years. The great hall's doors exploded open. He entered like a storm given human form, his presence so overwhelming that the very air seemed to bend around him. Tall didn't begin to describe him. He towered over even the largest pack warriors, his frame built for violence and dominance. Dark hair fell to his shoulders, framing a face that belonged on ancient coins, all sharp angles and predatory beauty. But it was his eyes that stole her breath completely. Golden, not hazel, not amber, but pure molten gold that seemed to burn within a fire. Behind him came his royal guard, 12 warriors whose very stance radiated lethal competence. They moved in perfect formation, weapons gleaming, their loyalty to their king written in every line of their bodies. But Lyra barely saw them. Her entire world had narrowed to the figure striding through her pack's great hall as if he owned it. Which, she realised with growing terror, he essentially did. Alpha Morrison rushed forward, his own considerable presence diminished to nothing in the face of his king. "Your Majesty," he said, dropping to one knee in formal submission, "the Crimson Moon Pack is honoured beyond measure by your presence. We have prepared everything according to your specifications." Darius barely glanced at him, those burning eyes scanning the hall with predatory assessment. "Where are the war beasts?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls themselves. "Arriving at sunset, as you commanded. They are being held in the sacred grove until the ceremony begins tomorrow at dawn." Alpha Morrison's voice carried the strain of addressing a power that could unmake him with a word. "Good. And the warriors who will attempt the bonding? We have 12 candidates, all from our finest bloodlines." Alpha Morrison's chest swelled with pride as he gestured toward a group of pack members who stepped forward in perfect formation. "Led by our strongest female warrior, Selene Nightshade." At the mention of Selene's name, Lyra watched the beautiful alpha female emerge from the group with liquid grace. She was magnificent as always, her silver blonde hair catching the light like spun moonbeams, her emerald eyes bright with confidence. She wore ceremonial leathers that displayed every curve of her perfect form, and when she smiled at the king, it was with the assurance of someone who had never doubted her own worth. "Your Majesty," Selene said, her voice like honey and wine as she executed a bow that managed to be both respectful and subtly provocative. "I am honoured to represent my pack in tomorrow's ceremony." Darius's golden eyes settled on her, and Lyra watched something that might have been approval flicker across his features. "You come recommended by many. Your bloodline traces back to the warrior queens of old. It does, Your Majesty." Selene's smile widened, and Lyra could see the other pack members practically vibrating with excitement. Their golden daughter was making the perfect impression, saying all the right things, representing everything noble about their pack. But then something impossible happened. Darius's gaze swept the hall one more time, a final assessment before he dismissed them all to their preparations. His golden eyes moved past the assembled warriors, past the pack leadership, past everything important and worthy of a king's attention, and landed directly on Lyra. The world stopped. Time stretched like honey as those burning eyes locked onto hers across the vast space of the great hall. She should have looked away, should have dropped her gaze and melted into invisibility, as she had been trained to do her entire life. Kings did not look at servants. Kings did not see powerless nobodies who scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots. But she couldn't look away. Something in those golden depths held her trapped, a recognition so profound it made her soul ache. Her wolf threw itself against the barriers of her consciousness, howling with a desperate need she didn't understand. And deep in her chest, that pressure exploded outward like a dam bursting, flooding her with sensations so intense she nearly cried out, "Mate." The word whispered through her mind like a prayer, like a curse, like a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. Girls like her didn't have mate bonds with kings. Girls like her didn't have mate bonds at all. But Darius had gone completely still, his powerful frame frozen in place as if struck by lightning. She watched his nostrils flare slightly, scenting the air, and saw something flash across his features that looked almost like recognition. Then Alpha Morrison stepped directly into his line of sight, effectively blocking Lyra from view as he continued his welcoming speech. "Your Majesty, shall we show you to your quarters? The ceremony will require your presence at dawn, and I'm sure you wish to rest after your long journey." The spell shattered. Darius blinked, his attention snapping back to the Alpha before him as if nothing had happened. "Of course," he said, his voice perfectly controlled, "lead the way." As the royal party moved toward the guest quarters, Lyra remained frozen where she stood, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force she was certain everyone in the hall could hear it. What had just happened? What was that impossible moment of connection, that recognition that made no sense? She pressed a hand to her chest where that strange pressure had been building, only to find it had transformed into something else entirely. An ache, a pull, a golden thread that seemed to stretch across the hall toward the king who was already disappearing from sight. Impossible. But as she knelt to retrieve her forgotten cleaning supplies, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp the brush, Lyra found herself replaying that moment over and over, the way his eyes had found hers across an impossible distance, the way her wolf had reacted like it recognized something essential, the way her entire world had shifted on its axis in the space of 3 heartbeats. Around her, the pack members buzzed with excitement about their king's arrival, about Celine's perfect performance, about tomorrow's ceremony that would surely elevate their pack to legendary status. But Lyra heard none of it. Her mind was consumed by golden eyes and the terrifying possibility that everything she thought she knew about herself might be wrong. She finished cleaning the great hall in a daze, her movements automatic while her thoughts churned with dangerous possibilities. By the time she was done, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold that reminded her too much of eyes that had seen straight through to her soul. Tomorrow, the war beasts would arrive. Tomorrow, the ceremony would begin. Tomorrow, warriors would be chosen and legends would be born. And somewhere in this pack compound, the most powerful alpha king in their world was settling in for the night, probably already forgetting the moment when his gaze had found a powerless servant girl across a crowded hall. But Lyra would not forget, could not forget, because deep in her chest that golden thread continued to pull, whispering impossible truths about destiny and bonds and the terrifying possibility that sometimes the universe chose champions from the most unlikely places. That night, alone in the darkness of the servants' quarters, Lyra could not escape the golden thread that pulled at her chest with every breath. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw burning gold staring back at her, felt that moment of impossible recognition flooding through her like liquid fire. Her wolf paced endlessly beneath her skin, whimpering and clawing at barriers that had held for 20 years, desperate for something she couldn't name and didn't dare acknowledge. When the summons came at midnight, she almost wasn't surprised. A royal guard appeared at her door, his expression carefully neutral as he delivered the message that made her blood freeze in her veins. "His Majesty requires refreshments in the Eastern Garden. You are to serve him, alone." The walk through the darkened pack compound felt like a march to her execution. Her hands shook as she carried the silver tray laden with wine and fruits, each step bringing her closer to a confrontation she was utterly unprepared for. The eastern garden was the most private space in the entire compound, hidden behind high stone walls and ancient oak trees that blocked out the moon. She found him standing with his back to the entrance, a figure carved from shadow and starlight beside the reflecting pool. Even in stillness, his presence dominated the space, made the very air seem charged with dangerous energy. She could smell him now, cedar and steel and something wild that made her wolf throw itself against her consciousness with renewed desperation. "Your Majesty," she whispered, setting the tray on the stone table with hands that trembled despite her best efforts. "As requested." He turned slowly, and the sight of his face in the moonlight nearly dropped her to her knees. Beautiful didn't begin to describe him. He was carved perfection, all sharp angles and predatory grace. But it was his eyes that undid her completely. Those golden orbs burned with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul, reading secrets she didn't even know she kept. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her bones. "Lyra, Your Majesty." She kept her gaze fixed on the ground between them, every instinct screaming at her to run while she still could. "I am nobody. I serve the pack in whatever capacity is needed. Liar." The single word hit her like a physical blow, forcing her to look up at him in shock. Those burning eyes held her trapped, and she watched something that looked almost like pain flicker across his features before being buried beneath royal control. "You felt it too," he said, taking a step closer that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "In the great hall, the recognition." She wanted to deny it, to maintain the fiction that she was nothing more than a servant girl who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But standing here in the moonlight with the mate bond singing between them like a living thing, pretense seemed not just impossible but cruel. "I don't understand what's happening," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of water lapping against stone. "This isn't possible. Kings don't... people like you don't what? Bond with servants? With nobodies?" His voice carried an edge that might have been bitterness, might have been pain. "You think I chose this?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that terrified her. Because if he hadn't chosen it, if the mate bond had simply snapped into place regardless of logic or propriety or the vast gulf between their stations, then they were both trapped in an impossible situation. "Tell me your bloodline," he commanded, and there was something desperate in his tone, despite the royal authority. "Tell me there is some noble heritage, some connection to power that would make this comprehensible." Lyra felt tears sting her eyes as she shook her head. "I have no bloodline worth claiming, Your Majesty. I am the pack's unwanted, raised by servants, trained for nothing but invisible labour. My wolf is weak, my shifting incomplete. I am exactly what I appear to be, nothing." The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread through the very foundations of the world. She watched Darius close his eyes, his powerful frame going rigid as if struck by physical pain. When he opened them again, the gold had dimmed to something that looked almost like grief. "Then we are both damned," he said quietly, "because my wolf recognizes you as surely as the sun recognizes dawn. The bond is there, Lyra, real and undeniable and completely impossible." She felt her knees give way, sinking onto the stone bench beside the reflecting pool before she collapsed entirely. The implications crashed over her in waves, not just for her, but for him, for his kingdom, for the political alliances that depended on his marriage to someone worthy of a crown. "You have obligations," she whispered, "treaties and alliances and a kingdom that needs a queen who can stand beside you with honour, not a servant who scrubs floors and empties chamber pots." He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the wild scent that made her wolf keen with desperate longing. When he spoke, His voice was rough with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't spent the last 6 hours trying to convince myself this is some kind of mistake, some cruel trick of fate? I have a kingdom to rule, wars to wage, a bloodline to continue. I cannot afford to be bound to—" "To someone like me," she finished for him, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. But before she could rise, before she could flee back to the safety of invisibility and acceptance, he did something that made her breath catch in her throat. He knelt. The Alpha King of 7 kingdoms, the most powerful ruler on the continent, lowered himself to his knees beside her bench so their eyes were level. And when he reached out to touch her face with fingers that trembled despite his strength, she felt the golden thread between them blaze to life with such intensity it nearly stopped her heart. "To someone I cannot live without," he corrected softly. "To someone my soul recognizes even when my mind cannot accept it. To someone who makes me question everything I thought I knew about destiny and duty and the cruel games the universe plays with mortal hearts." The touch of his skin against hers was like lightning, like coming home, like every fairy tale and nightmare rolled into one impossible moment. Her wolf stopped pacing, stopped whimpering, and instead pressed against her consciousness with something that felt almost like peace. "This is madness," she whispered, even as she found herself leaning into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. "Yes," he agreed, "it is, and it will destroy us both if anyone discovers it." The truth of that statement settled between them like a lead weight. She was nobody, nothing, a servant who could offer him nothing but scandal and political ruin. He was a king who needed a queen worthy of the crown, someone who could bear heirs and forge alliances and stand beside him as an equal in the eyes of the world. The mate bond didn't care about any of that. The golden thread between them pulled tighter, whispering of forever and soul-deep recognition and love that transcended every rational consideration. But the world cared very much. Darius seemed to read her thoughts in her expression, because his hand fell away from her face, and he rose to his feet with fluid grace. When he spoke again, his voice had returned to the controlled neutrality of a king addressing a subject. "You will say nothing of this to anyone. The bond exists, but it cannot be acknowledged. Tomorrow the war beasts arrive, and the ceremony will proceed as planned. You will watch from wherever servants are permitted, and you will remember that some things in this world are sacred." The dismissal hit her like a slap, even though she had expected it, even though it was the only logical response to their impossible situation. She rose on unsteady legs, curtsying as deeply as her trembling knees would allow. "Of course, Your Majesty, I understand completely." She turned to go, to flee back to the safety of shadows and servitude, but his voice stopped her at the garden entrance. Lyra. She looked back to find him silhouetted against the moonlight, a figure of terrible beauty and devastating power who would never be hers, could never be hers, should never be hers. "If things were different," he said quietly, "if the world were different, if we were different—" "I know," she whispered, "I know." And then she ran, fleeing through the darkened compound, with tears streaming down her face and the mate bond screaming in her chest like a wound that would never heal. Behind her, she could feel him watching until she disappeared from sight, and the golden thread between them, stretched thin but never broke, a constant reminder of everything they could never have. Tomorrow the ceremony would begin. Tomorrow warriors would be chosen, and bonds would be forged, and the course of history would be shaped by ancient magic. Tomorrow she would watch from the shadows as the king chose someone worthy, someone powerful, someone who could stand beside him without bringing shame to his crown. And the mate bond would remain their secret, buried beneath duty and propriety and the vast gulf between a king and a nobody who should never have been chosen by fate's cruel design. The days that followed were a blur of desperate searching and unanswered questions that drove Lyra to the edge of madness. She could not sleep, could not eat, could not perform even the simplest tasks without feeling the golden thread in her chest pull taut with longing for a king she could never claim. The mate bond had awakened something in her that refused to be ignored, a restless energy that made her wolf pace endlessly beneath her skin. For the first time in her life, invisibility felt like a prison rather than protection. 3 days before the War Games ceremony, desperation finally drove her to seek the one person in the pack who might have answers. Elder Moira lived in a cottage at the edge of the compound, surrounded by herb gardens and wind chimes that sang with voices older than memory. She was ancient even by pack standards, her hair white as winter snow, her eyes clouded with cataracts that somehow saw more than those with perfect vision. The pack whispered that she remembered the time before, when magic flowed freely through the world and war beasts walked among them like trusted companions. If anyone knew why a powerless servant could be chosen as mate to the most powerful alpha king alive, it would be her. Lyra found her sitting in the garden as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, her gnarled hands weaving dried herbs into complicated patterns that hurt to look at directly. The old woman didn't look up when she approached, but her voice carried clearly across the evening air. "I have been expecting you, child. Sit." The command was gentle but absolute. Lyra sank onto the wooden bench across from her, hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. The questions she had carried for days suddenly seemed too large, too dangerous to voice in the presence of someone who might actually have answers. "You want to know why," Elder Moira said without preamble, her clouded eyes finding Lyra's with unsettling accuracy. "Why the mate bond chose you, why your wolf recognizes a king when you are nothing but a servant, why everything you have been told about yourself feels like lies when the golden thread pulls at your heart." The words hit her like physical blows, each one confirming fears she had barely dared to acknowledge. "Yes," she whispered, "I need to understand what's happening to me." Elder Moira set down her herb weaving and leaned back in her chair, her ancient face grave with the weight of secrets too long kept. "What I am about to tell you will change everything, child. Once you know the truth, there will be no going back to the comfortable fiction of your powerlessness." Lyra felt her heart skip, whether from hope or terror she couldn't tell. "Please, I have to know." The old woman was quiet for so long that Lyra began to wonder if she had changed her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades, of choices made in darkness and paid for in blood. 20 years ago, I helped deliver a baby during the darkest night our pack had ever known. The mother was dying, her strength spent bringing new life into a world that would surely destroy it. With her last breath, she begged me to hide her child, to conceal the bloodline that would make the babe a target for every enemy our people had ever made. The implications crashed over Lyra in waves, each one more impossible than the last. "You're saying that my mother—" "Your mother was Princess Lyanna Silvermoon," Elder Moira said quietly, "daughter of the lost Alpha King Regent who ruled the Northern Kingdoms before the Great War, sister to the current Queen of the Eastern Territories, the last living heir to a bloodline that traces back to the very first Alpha Kings who united our kind under a single crown." The world tilted sideways. Lyra gripped the bench so hard her knuckles went white, fighting against the dizziness that threatened to drag her into darkness. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be true. She was nobody, nothing, a servant raised by servants with no power and no worth. But even as her mind rejected the revelation, something deep in her chest recognized the truth of it. The way her wolf had always felt caged, suppressed. The strange pull she felt toward ancient places and forgotten magic. The mate bond that had chosen her despite every logical reason it should have passed her by. The suppression ritual, Elder Moira continued, her voice gentle but relentless. performed when you were 3 days old, designed to lock away your wolf and your power so completely that even you would never know what you truly were. We told everyone you were the child of servants who died in the plague. We raised you to believe yourself powerless, worthless, invisible. Why?" The word came out as a broken whisper. "Why would you do that to me? Because your bloodline carries a prophecy, child." The old woman's eyes seemed to glow in the gathering darkness. The last silver moon heir will either unite the kingdoms in an age of unprecedented peace, or destroy them all in fire and blood. Your enemies would have killed you in your cradle if they had known you lived. Your allies would have used you as a political pawn before you could walk. Lyra felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't remember when she had started crying. Everything she had believed about herself, every cruel word she had endured, every moment of learned helplessness, all of it built on a lie designed to keep her alive. "The mate bond knows," Elder Moira said softly. "Ancient magic recognizes ancient blood, regardless of suppression rituals or careful deceptions. Your king's wolf sees what we have hidden, calls to what we have locked away. The golden thread pulls because it connects two souls destined to reshape the world. But the suppression—" Lyra's voice broke on the words. "Can it be undone? Everything can be undone, child, but the cost is always higher than the price of maintaining the lie." The old woman leaned forward, her clouded eyes boring into Lyra's with frightening intensity. "If your power awakens, if your true nature emerges, there will be no hiding any more. Your enemies will come. War will follow. Blood will be spilled in quantities that would drown kingdoms." The choice stretched before her like a chasm, terrible in its implications. Remain a powerless servant, forever bound to a king she could never claim, watching from the shadows as he chose someone worthy of his crown, or embrace a birthright that would paint targets on everyone she had ever cared about, that would drag entire kingdoms into conflict, whether she wanted it or not. "What would you do?" she whispered. Elder Moira smiled then, an expression both sad and proud that transformed her ancient features. "I would choose truth, child, no matter the cost, because lies, no matter how comfortable, are still prisons, and some cages are too small for souls destined to soar." The old woman rose from her chair with surprising grace, gathering her herb weaving, as if their conversation had been about the weather rather than revelations that could reshape the continent. "The ceremony begins tomorrow at dawn. The war beasts will choose their champions, and the course of history will be decided by bonds forged in ancient magic." She paused at the cottage door, looking back at Lyra with eyes that suddenly seemed clear as starlight. "But remember, child, destiny is not about the bloodline you carry or the power you were born to wield. It is about the choices you make when the world offers you the chance to become who you truly are." And then she was gone, leaving Lyra alone in the garden with the weight of 20 years of lies pressing against her chest like a stone. Princess, heir, prophecy. The words echoed in her mind like tolling bells, each one reshaping everything she thought she knew about herself. Tomorrow the ceremony would begin. Tomorrow warriors would be tested, and beasts would choose champions, and the fate of kingdoms would be decided. Tomorrow she would have to choose between the comfortable lie of powerlessness and the terrifying truth of a destiny she had never asked for. The golden thread in her chest pulsed with each heartbeat, connecting her to a king who thought he was bound to a nobody, who didn't know that the servant girl he could never claim carried the blood of the very kings who had founded his throne. Lyra closed her eyes and felt her wolf stir for the first time in her life, not with the weak whimper of a suppressed creature, but with the low growl of something ancient and powerful finally beginning to wake. The lies had protected her for 20 years. Tomorrow she would discover if the truth would set her free or destroy everything she had ever known. But tonight, for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to stop being nobody and start becoming who she was always meant to be. The morning of the war games dawned cold and grey, as if the very sky understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Lyra woke before sunrise in the servants' quarters, her dreams haunted by golden eyes and ancient prophecies that transformed everything she thought she knew about herself. Princess Lyanna Silvermoon's daughter, the last heir to a bloodline that could unite kingdoms or destroy them. The revelation sat in her chest like a living thing, pulsing with every heartbeat alongside the mate bond that connected her to a king who thought he was bound to a nobody. But today she had to be nobody once more. Today she had to watch from the servants' section as warriors attempted to bond with creatures of legend, while the truth of her heritage burned in her throat like swallowed fire. The ceremonial arena had been transformed overnight into something that belonged in the realm of dreams rather than waking reality. Ancient banners hung from towering poles, their symbols worked in silver thread that caught the morning light like captured starfire. The fighting ground itself had been cleared of sand and blood, replaced with circles carved from stone and inlaid with runes that hurt to look at directly. 7 massive platforms stood at intervals around the perimeter, each one waiting to house a war beast whose presence would shake the foundations of their world. Pack members filled the stands in ceremonial dress, their voices hushed with reverence and barely contained excitement. This was the stuff of legends, the kind of event that would be spoken of for generations. Children would grow up hearing stories of the day war beasts returned to choose champions from among the living. Lyra took her place in the servants' section, a narrow gallery tucked behind the main seating where those of her supposed station could witness history without intruding on their betters' experience. From here she had a perfect view of the royal platform where Alpha King Darius sat in carved obsidian majesty, his golden eyes surveying the arena with predatory focus. He looked magnificent and terrible, every inch the ruler of 7 kingdoms. Sunlight caught the silver threading in his ceremonial leathers, and the crown of black metal and ancient gems on his brow seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When his gaze swept the arena, even the bravest warriors straightened in automatic deference to power that could reshape continents. But Lyra knew what others could not see: the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the armrests of his throne just slightly too tight. The mate bond stretched between them like a golden wire, carrying whispers of his emotional state directly to her consciousness. He was fighting the same battle she was, trying to ignore the pull that connected them while fulfilling the duties that crown and kingdom demanded. The ceremony began with the ancient words, spoken in the old tongue by pack shamans whose voices carried the weight of tradition older than written history. Lyra felt her suppressed wolf stir as the ritualistic phrases washed over the arena, power responding to power even through the barriers that had contained her true nature for 20 years. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The war beasts entered the arena. 7 creatures of myth and legend padded onto the ceremonial ground, each one more magnificent and terrifying than stories could possibly convey. A silver-furred beast with eyes like winter storms, a creature of living shadow whose form seemed to shift and flow like smoke given substance, a golden-maned beast whose every step left scorched paw prints in the stone. But it was the 7th beast that stole the breath from every throat in the arena, the shadow beast. Ancient didn't begin to describe the creature that emerged from the entrance tunnel like darkness given form and purpose. Massive beyond comprehension, it stood nearly 8 feet at the shoulder, its fur so black it seemed to absorb light itself. Intelligence burned in eyes like molten amber, an awareness that spoke of centuries spent walking the boundary between the mortal world and realms beyond naming. When it moved, it was with liquid grace that made no sound despite its enormous size. When it breathed, the very air around it shimmered with power that made the stones of the arena sing in harmonic resonance. This was not just a war beast. This was legend incarnate, a creature that had chosen warriors who reshaped history and toppled empires. The crowd fell silent as death, awed into speechlessness by proximity to something that existed at the intersection of flesh and myth. Alpha Morrison's voice cracked slightly as he began the formal presentations, calling forward the 12 warriors who would attempt to bond with the assembled beasts. One by one, they stepped into the sacred circles, each representing the finest their pack had to offer in strength, bloodline, and training. Selene came last, and she was breathtaking. Clad in ceremonial leathers that displayed every curve of her perfect form, her silver blonde hair braided with gems that caught the light like captured stars, she moved across the arena floor with confidence that bordered on arrogance. The crowd murmured appreciatively as she took her place in the centre circle, the one reserved for those attempting to bond with the shadow beast itself. She looked like everything a war beast could want in a bonded partner: beautiful, powerful, noble, trained from birth for exactly this moment. When she smiled up at the royal platform, it was with the assurance of someone who had never doubted her own destiny. The first attempts began with the lesser beasts, warriors approaching the creatures with varying degrees of success and failure. Some were ignored entirely, dismissed with the casual indifference of beings who recognized nothing worthy in the supplicants before them. Others triggered more violent rejections, warriors scrambling away from claws and fangs as ancient powers found them wanting. But it was when Selene approached the shadow beast that the true magnitude of what was happening became clear. She moved with practiced grace toward the massive creature, her voice strong and confident as she recited the bonding words in the old tongue. Her bloodline was impeccable, her training flawless, her presentation everything the ceremony demanded. She was the perfect candidate, the obvious choice, the warrior everyone expected to be chosen. The shadow beast looked at her with those molten amber eyes for exactly 3 seconds, and then it turned away. Not with violence, not with the dramatic rejection that had marked other failed attempts, simply indifference, as if she were not worth the effort of acknowledgement, as if her perfect bloodline and flawless training meant absolutely nothing to a creature that had lived for centuries and seen the rise and fall of kingdoms. The silence that followed was deafening. Selene stood frozen in the centre circle, her perfect composure cracking for the first time in Lyra's memory. The crowd whispered in shocked confusion, unable to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't supposed to happen. Selene was destined for greatness, chosen by birth and breeding and 20 years of careful preparation. But the shadow beast had dismissed her as if she were nothing. One by one, the other warriors attempted their approaches to the ancient creature. One by one, they were met with the same casual indifference, as if the shadow beast were waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Even the most elite fighters, those with bloodlines stretching back to the first Alpha Kings, failed to earn so much as a second glance from the legendary creature. As the morning wore on and failure followed failure, a strange tension began building in the arena. The other war beasts had shown some interest in various warriors, though none had completed full bonding ceremonies. But the shadow beast remained utterly unmoved, its massive form radiating boredom with the proceedings that everyone else found earth-shaking. From the royal platform, Lyra could feel Darius's growing unease through the mate bond. This was not how the ceremony was supposed to unfold. The shadow beast's presence was meant to honour his visit, to demonstrate the pack's worthiness to host such legendary creatures. Instead, they were witnessing the systematic rejection of their finest warriors by a creature that seemed to find nothing of interest in their carefully curated selection. The implications were staggering. If the shadow beast chose no one, if it left without bonding, the dishonour would follow the Crimson Moon Pack for generations. Worse, it might suggest that their bloodlines had grown too weak, too diluted to attract the attention of truly ancient powers. But as Lyra watched the massive creature survey the arena with those intelligent amber eyes, Something stirred deep in her chest. Her suppressed wolf lifted its head with a tension she had never felt before, and for just a moment she could swear the shadow beast's gaze flickered in her direction. Impossible. She was hidden in the servants' section, invisible as always, forgotten by everyone who mattered. Ancient creatures of legend did not notice powerless servant girls who scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots. But that golden thread in her chest pulsed with sudden awareness, and her newly awakened understanding of her true heritage whispered dangerous possibilities. What if the shadow beast wasn't finding the warriors wanting because they lacked power or bloodline or training? What if it was waiting for someone who had not yet been called forward? The ceremony continued around her, failure following failure as the most elite warriors of their generation found themselves dismissed by creatures that had once chosen champions capable of reshaping history. And in the servants' section, invisible and forgotten, the lost princess of the Silver Moon bloodline watched and wondered if legend might be about to right itself in ways no one could possibly expect. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the arena as the ceremony reached its most desperate hour, and Lyra found herself thrust into the centre of everything she had spent her life avoiding. The shadow beast had rejected every warrior presented to it, each dismissal more devastating than the last. Elite fighters with bloodlines stretching back centuries had been found wanting by the ancient creature, their carefully crafted confidence shattered by indifference so complete it bordered on contempt. The other war beasts had shown moderate interest in various candidates, but none had completed the full bonding ritual that would mark the ceremony as successful. Alpha Morrison's voice carried the strain of mounting desperation as he addressed the crowd. The sacred grounds require cleansing before the evening ceremony can commence. All warriors will withdraw to prepare for the second round of presentations. That was when Beta Marcus's voice cut across the arena like a blade, filled with the particular malice he reserved for reminding her of her place. The servant girl will clean the arena. She knows how to make herself invisible while her betters conduct important business. Lyra felt her blood freeze as every eye in the arena turned toward the servants' section. This was her worst nightmare realized, being singled out, made visible, forced into the central space where she could not hide or disappear. But refusing a direct command in front of the assembled pack would bring punishment far worse than humiliation. She rose on unsteady legs, gathering the cleaning supplies that had been placed beside the servants' section with practiced efficiency. The walk down the stone steps toward the arena floor felt like descending into her own execution, each footfall echoing in the suddenly silent amphitheatre. The war beasts remained on their platforms, watching the proceedings with varying degrees of interest. The silver-furred creature with winter-storm eyes tracked her movement with predatory focus. The golden-maned beast whose steps left scorched prints tilted its massive head as she passed. But it was the shadow beast that made her steps falter, its molten amber gaze settling on her with an intensity that made her wolf throw itself against the barriers of her consciousness. She forced herself to keep walking, to ignore the way power seemed to crackle in the air around the ancient creature. She was nobody, nothing, invisible as always. Ancient legends did not concern themselves with servant girls who scrubbed floors, but even as she told herself that comfortable lie, the golden thread in her chest began to sing. The arena floor stretched before her, vast and marked with the sacred circles where warriors had failed to prove their worth. She knelt in the centre, unpacking her supplies with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to remain inconspicuous. The sooner she completed this task, the sooner she could fade back into invisibility and safety. That was when she made the mistake of breathing. The air in the arena was thick with the scent of ancient power, charged with magic that had lingered since the war beast's arrival. But underneath it all, woven through every breath like a golden thread made manifest, was something else entirely. Mate. The recognition hit her with the force of a physical blow, so intense and overwhelming that she nearly cried out. This close to the shadow beast, with no walls or distance to mute the sensation, the mate bond blazed to life with an intensity that made her previous experiences seem like distant whispers. But it wasn't coming from the royal platform where Darius sat in obsidian majesty. It was coming from the shadow beast itself. The realization crashed over her in waves of impossible understanding. The mate bond didn't connect her to the king at all. It connected her to the ancient creature that wore his face when walking among mortals. Darius was the shadow beast. The shadow beast was Darius. They were one and the same, separated only by the barriers between human and primal, mortal and mythic. Her scrub brush fell from nerveless fingers as the truth rewrote everything she thought she understood about the world. The most powerful Alpha King alive wasn't just bonded to a war beast. He was the war beast, the legendary creature that had chosen warriors to reshape history, that had walked the boundary between realms for centuries beyond counting. And he was her mate. The shadow beast went completely still on its platform, massive head turning toward her with laser focus that made every person in the arena hold their breath. Those molten amber eyes, Darius's eyes she realized with dawning wonder, fixed on her with recognition so profound it shook the foundations of reality itself. One breath, that was all it took. The ancient creature's nostrils flared as it caught her scent across the arena, and everything changed. Power exploded outward from its position like a shockwave, washing over the assembled crowd with force that made the stones beneath their feet tremble. The other war beasts lifted their heads in immediate attention, recognizing something momentous in their leader's behavior. But the shadow beast had eyes only for her. It rose to its feet in one fluid motion, 8 feet of legendary power and primordial grace, every line of its massive frame focused on the servant girl kneeling in the center of the arena. When it moved, it was with purpose that brooked no obstacle, no hesitation, no doubt. The crowd erupted into chaos. Screams of terror filled the air as people scrambled for the exits, certain they were about to witness the brutal mauling of a powerless servant by a creature of myth. Guards rushed forward, weapons drawn, though what mortal steel could do against a being that had walked through centuries remained unclear. But Lyra couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare in wonder and terror as legend incarnate stalked toward her with predatory grace. This close, she could see things that no one else would notice. The intelligence burning in those amber eyes, the careful control in every massive pore placement, the way power rippled beneath fur so dark it seemed to absorb light itself. This close, she could feel the mate bond singing between them like a golden wire pulled taut, connecting her soul to something ancient and powerful and utterly beyond her comprehension. The shadow beast reached the edge of the sacred circle and stopped, its massive head lowering until those burning eyes were level with hers. For a heartbeat that lasted eternity, they stared at each other across a gulf that separated mortal from myth, servant from king, nobody from legend. Then the ancient creature did something that shattered every assumption anyone had ever held about power and worthiness, and the cruel hierarchies that governed their world. It submitted. The massive head lowered further, touching the stone floor of the arena in a gesture of deference so profound it redefined the meaning of surrender. 8 feet of legendary power, centuries of accumulated authority, the creature that had chosen warriors to topple empires, all of it offered in submission to a girl who scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots. The silence that followed was absolute. No one breathed, no one moved. No one could process what they were witnessing, because it violated every natural law they understood about strength and dominance and the order of things. But Lyra understood. Through the golden thread that connected them, Through the mate bond that had chosen her despite every logical reason it shouldn't have, she felt the truth that no one else could comprehend. The shadow beast wasn't submitting to a powerless servant, it was recognizing its queen. The suppression barriers that had contained her true nature for 20 years began to crack under the pressure of recognition so profound it could not be denied. Power stirred in her chest, ancient and patient and vast as oceans. Her wolf lifted its head for the first time in her life and looked at the world through eyes that blazed with silver fire. Around the arena, the crowd slowly realized they were witnessing something that would be spoken of in whispers for 1,000 years. The shadow beast, legend incarnate, had chosen not a warrior or a noble or someone trained for greatness. It had chosen her. And in that moment of recognition, as power began breaking through the barriers that had hidden her true nature, Lyra finally understood what Elder Moira had tried to tell her. Some truths were too large to remain buried, some destinies were too powerful to be suppressed by ritual and lies, and 20 years of learned helplessness. The last heir of the Silver Moon bloodline knelt in the centre of an arena, staring into the eyes of legend incarnate, while the mate bond sang between them like the universe itself, celebrating the reunion of two souls meant to reshape the world. Everything was about to change. The world narrowed to that single moment when legend knelt before a girl who had spent 20 years believing she was nothing. The shadow beast's massive head remained pressed to the arena stones in perfect submission, 8 feet of primordial power offering itself to someone the crowd had dismissed as unworthy of notice. The silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through the ceremonial banners and the distant sound of pack members fleeing in terror. Lyra knelt frozen in the sacred circle, her mind struggling to process what was happening. This close to the ancient creature, the mate bond blazed between them with intensity that made her bones ache, and her suppressed wolf claw desperately at barriers that had contained it for 2 decades. She could feel power stirring in her chest, ancient and patient and vast as storm systems, responding to recognition so profound it rewrote the laws of nature. But it was the intelligence burning in those molten amber eyes that undid her completely. Not the mindless hunger of a beast, not the calculating assessment of a predator. This was awareness sharp as blade edges, consciousness that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, knowledge accumulated across centuries of walking the boundary between mortal and mythic realms. This was Darius looking at her through eyes that belonged to legend itself. The realization hit her again with fresh force, each repetition making it more real and more impossible. The most powerful Alpha King alive was the Shadow Beast. The creature that had chosen warriors to reshape history was her mate. The legend that had walked through centuries, waiting for someone worthy of its bond, had found her scrubbing floors in a servant's uniform. Slowly, trembling with terror and wonder and power that threatened to crack her ribs from the inside, Lyra reached out her hand toward the massive head pressed to the stones before her. The moment her fingers touched the shadow beast's fur, the world exploded. Power slammed into her consciousness like a dam bursting, 20 years of suppressed magic breaking free all at once. The mate bond completed with force that made her scream, golden light erupting from her skin as ancient barriers shattered like spun glass. Her wolf threw back its head and howled for the first time in her life, the sound echoing through the arena with harmonics that made the stones sing in response. But this time the howl that emerged from her throat was not the weak whimper of a suppressed creature. It was the war cry of something ancient and powerful and absolutely untouchable, a sound that spoke of royal bloodlines and forgotten magic and destiny that could no longer be denied. The shadow beast lifted its massive head, and she watched wonder and recognition and fierce possessive joy blaze across features that could have been carved from living starlight. When it spoke, the voice that emerged was layered with harmonics that belonged to both man and myth, both king and legend. Mate, it said, and the single word rewrote the fundamental nature of reality itself. Around the arena, the remaining pack members who hadn't fled pressed themselves against walls and barriers, terror and awe warring in their expressions as they witnessed something that violated every natural law they understood. But Lyra had eyes only for the creature before her, for the impossible fusion of everything she had thought she knew about power and worthiness, and the bonds that connected souls across lifetimes. The other war beasts moved then, padding down from their platforms with liquid grace to surround the bonding pair. But instead of challenge or threat, their massive forms radiated something that looked almost like reverence. They arranged themselves in a protective circle, ancient powers acknowledging something even more ancient, even more fundamental. The golden light that blazed from Lyra's skin began to spread, illuminating symbols carved into the arena stones that had remained hidden for generations. Runes blazed to life under the touch of power that recognized their purpose, and she realized with dawning wonder that this space had been designed for exactly this moment. The entire arena was a focusing circle, built to channel and amplify the energies released when legend finally found its equal. Her clothing began to change, servant's rough fabric dissolving into threads of silver and starlight that reformed around her body as garments fit for a queen. The dull brown of her hair shifted to silver white that caught the light like spun moonbeams, and when she looked down at her hands, she saw skin that seemed to glow from within with power that had been locked away since birth. But it was her eyes that completed the transformation. The muddy brown that had marked her as unremarkable blazed silver white, twin stars that held depths of power sufficient to reshape continents. She was beautiful, not in the practiced way of someone trained to catch attention, but with the terrifying beauty of natural disasters, of forces so fundamental they redefined the meaning of existence itself. This was what had been hidden beneath 20 years of careful suppression, what Elder Moira and her mother's supporters had locked away to keep her safe from enemies who would have killed her in her cradle. This was Princess Lyanna Silvermoon's daughter, the last heir to a bloodline that traced back to the first Alpha Kings, finally claiming the destiny that had been written in her bones since birth. The shadow beast rose to its full height beside her, and she realized that she was no longer looking up at a creature that dwarfed her completely. The power blazing through her system had changed more than just her appearance. She stood taller, moved with grace that spoke of training she had never received, carried herself with authority that came from sources deeper than learning. When the ancient creature lowered its massive head to nuzzle her neck, she felt no fear, only recognition, only the profound rightness of two halves of something larger finally finding each other after lifetimes of separation. The crowd that remained began to whisper, voices hushed with awe and terror as they slowly realized what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a war beast choosing a champion. This was legend recognizing legend, ancient power calling to ancient blood, the fulfillment of prophecies that predated their pack's founding. From the royal platform, she could feel Darius's human consciousness blazing with emotions too complex to name. Joy and terror and possessive recognition and the devastating knowledge that everything had just changed in ways that would reshape 7 kingdoms. Through the mate bond, she felt his struggle to maintain royal composure, while his soul sang with triumph at finally finding the other half of himself. But there were others watching who felt no joy at this impossible bonding. Selene Nightshade stood at the edge of the arena, her perfect features twisted with rage and humiliation and growing understanding of what Lyra's transformation meant for her own carefully planned future. The beautiful alpha female who had expected to be chosen, who had trained her entire life for this moment, now found herself witnessing the elevation of someone she had dismissed as beneath notice. Around her, pack members who had spent 20 years treating Lyra as invisible began to realize they had been casually cruel to someone whose bloodline made their own seem common as dirt. The implications crashed through the crowd in waves. Every insult, every dismissal, every moment of casual cruelty directed at someone who carried royal blood and power sufficient to reshape the world. But Lyra felt no anger toward them, no desire for revenge against those who had treated her as nothing. The power blazing through her system brought with it a perspective vast as storm systems, ancient as the first stars. She understood now why her mother's supporters had hidden her true nature, why 20 years of lies and suppression had been necessary to keep her alive long enough to claim her birthright. The shadow beast pressed closer to her side, and she felt the profound rightness of their bond singing through every cell of her body. This was what the mate bond had been trying to tell her. Not that she was somehow worthy of a king's attention despite her powerlessness, but that she was the queen he had been waiting centuries to find. The transformation was complete. The lost princess had found her crown, the legend had chosen its champion, and the bond that would reshape the fate of kingdoms had finally been forged in light and power, and recognition too profound to be denied. But even as golden light continued to blaze from her transformed form, even as the other war beasts maintained their protective circle, even as the mate bond sang between them like the universe celebrating, Lyra knew this was only the beginning. Now came the truly dangerous part. Now she had to survive being everything she had never dared to dream she could become. The aftermath of transformation was chaos given form and voice. The arena erupted into pandemonium as pack members who had remained to witness the impossible bonding finally grasped the magnitude of what they had just seen. 20 years of casual cruelty directed at a servant girl who carried royal blood older than their pack's founding. 20 years of dismissing someone whose power, once awakened, blazed like a captured star in the centre of their sacred ground. Lyra stood in the eye of the storm, silver hair streaming in winds generated by her own unleashed magic, watching her former tormentors scatter like leaves before forces they could not comprehend. The shadow beast remained at her side, 8 feet of legendary power radiating protective menace toward anyone who might threaten his newly claimed mate. But it was the voices rising from the crowd that cut deepest. By the ancestors, that's Princess Lyanna's daughter, the lost heir. She's been here all along. We made her scrub floors. We treated her like she was nothing. The prophecy. The Silver Moon bloodline returns to unite the kingdoms or destroy them all. Each whispered recognition struck like physical blows, but not from shame or anger at their past treatment of her. The power blazing through her system brought perspective vast as centuries, understanding that reached beyond petty revenge into something approaching divine indifference. They had acted according to the lies they had been told, the careful deception that had kept her alive long enough to claim her birthright. But there were others in the crowd whose reactions carried far more dangerous implications. Selene Nightshade pushed through the scattered pack members, her beautiful features twisted with rage and humiliation that promised violence. Behind her came her faction, those who had invested their futures in her expected elevation to legendary status. They moved with purpose that spoke of desperation, of people watching their carefully laid plans crumble into dust. The shadow beast's massive head swung toward them, molten amber eyes blazing with warning that made the air itself crackle with menace. But Selene was beyond caring about threats, beyond reason, beyond anything except the devastating knowledge that her destiny had been stolen by someone she had dismissed as beneath notice. "This is impossible," she snarled, her voice carrying across the arena with venom that could poison rivers. "She's nobody, a servant, a mistake that should have been drowned at birth. The shadow beast doesn't choose weaklings." The words hit the charged air and shattered like glass against stone. Around the arena, those who remained went deathly still, recognizing that Selene had just issued a direct challenge to power that could reshape continents. The other war beasts lifted their massive heads, ancient consciousnesses focusing on the threat to their leader's chosen mate with predatory attention. But it was Lyra who responded, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that belonged to queens and goddesses and forces of nature given human form. "I am Lyra Silvermoon," she said, each word falling into the silence like stones dropped into still water. "Daughter of Princess Lyanna, heir to the bloodline that founded the First Kingdoms, chosen mate of legend incarnate. And you will show respect or face the consequences of your choices." The transformation wasn't just physical anymore. Authority blazed from her like visible fire, the kind of presence that made entire armies kneel without conscious thought. This was power that had been suppressed for 20 years, finally finding its voice, royal blood awakening to everything it had always been meant to command. But Selene was beyond reason, beyond fear, beyond anything except the fury of someone watching their world collapse around them. "You think changing your appearance makes you worthy?" she screamed, drawing the ceremonial blade that marked her as a warrior of the first rank. "You think magic can transform a servant into a queen? I'll show everyone what you really are when I carve the truth from your lying heart." She lunged forward with speed that would have made her a blur to normal eyes, the blade aimed directly at Lyra's throat in a strike designed to end the impossible bonding before it could reshape the political landscape of 7 kingdoms. The shadow beast moved. 8 feet of legendary power exploded into motion with speed that defied physics, massive jaws clamping down on Selene's weapon arm before the blade could travel more than inches. The crunch of breaking bones echoed across the arena as the ancient creature demonstrated exactly why it had been legend for centuries, why warriors who earned its favour became the stuff of songs and stories. Selene's scream of pain and rage was cut short as the shadow beast lifted her from the ground with casual ease, holding her suspended like a child's toy, while those burning amber eyes regarded her with the kind of patience reserved for insects that had forgotten their place in the natural order. But Lyra raised her hand, and power flowed from her gesture like visible command. Enough. The single word carried authority that made the stones themselves tremble. The shadow beast released Selene immediately, the broken warrior crashing to the arena floor in a heap of ceremonial leathers and shattered pride. Around them, the other war beasts settled back on their haunches, recognizing that their queen had chosen mercy over the more permanent solution her mate had been prepared to deliver. Lyra looked down at the woman who had tormented her for years, who had just attempted assassination in front of witnesses, who represented everything cruel and calculating about the pack hierarchy that had kept her invisible and powerless. She should have felt satisfaction, triumph, the sweet taste of revenge finally served. Instead, she felt only pity. "You spent so long believing you were destined for greatness," she said quietly, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent arena. But destiny was never about bloodline or training, or the approval of those who thought they understood power. It was about recognition, about ancient forces choosing their champions based on truths too deep for politics or ambition to touch. She gestured toward the shadow beast, whose massive form radiated contentment and fierce possessive joy, despite the violence that had just been averted. "He waited centuries for me, Selene, not for someone beautiful or trained or connected to prestigious families. For me specifically, because our souls recognized each other across lifetimes. That bond cannot be fought or stolen or earned through worthiness. It simply is." The words fell into silence, heavy with implications that would reshape how every person present understood the nature of power and destiny. But there were others watching whose reactions would prove far more dangerous than Selene's broken rage. From the royal platform, Lyra could feel Darius's human consciousness blazing with emotions too complex to name. Through the mate bond, she sensed his struggle to process the political implications of what had just occurred. His bonded mate wasn't just the lost Silver Moon heir, she was someone whose very existence would trigger every ancient alliance and enmity that had shaped the continent's history. The other pack alphas who had come to witness the ceremony were already moving, their faces grim with understanding of what her revealed identity meant for the delicate balance of power that kept 7 kingdoms from tearing each other apart. Messages would be sent before nightfall. Armies would begin moving before the week was out. Ancient enemies would remember old grievances, and ancient allies would call in debts that stretched back generations. But there were also those whose faces blazed with hope and recognition, and the kind of joy that came from witnessing the fulfillment of prophecies they had carried in their hearts for decades. Pack members who remembered the old stories, who had never stopped believing that the lost Silver Moon line would return to heal the wounds that had festered since the Great War. The transformation was complete, but the consequences were only beginning. As golden light continued to blaze from her skin, as the shadow beast pressed against her side in fierce possessive devotion, as the other war beasts maintained their protective circle around the bonding pair, Lyra finally understood what Elder Moira had tried to tell her about truth and consequences. She was no longer invisible. She could never be invisible again. The lost princess had claimed her crown, but now she would have to survive wearing it in a world where her very existence threatened to upset the balance of power that had kept entire kingdoms from destroying each other. The easy part was over. The real war was about to begin.